June the 29th, 2009. It is a quiet, warm day in Tuscany. The residents of the small coastal town of Viareggio are relaxing in their homes on a typical summer evening like any other. A freight train of 14 tanker cars full of liquefied petroleum gas is passing through the station. Travelling through Viareggio at just under 100 kilometers per hour, the front axle of the first tanker breaks. The train comes off the rails. The tank car is ripped open, releasing a cloud of petroleum vapor into the neighborhood. Within minutes, the cloud ignites. The entire area erupts into an inferno, fire racing through the streets. Vehicles explode one after another. Viareggio looks like a war zone.
That night, I heard a sound I could tell wasn't normal right away. The sound of steel breaking and the rails screeching. Right after that, I could smell gas.
The sky all of a sudden became red from the sea to the mountains. It was like a sunset happening at the wrong time, because it was just before midnight. We all asked ourselves what was going on.
There is Viareggio before June 29 and Viareggio after June 29. And I, being a Viareggio local to the end, feel this very deeply.
From the
Italian point of view, it's the first and the worst rail accident that has ever happened since World War II.
che si è verificato dal dopoguerra in avanti.
32 men, women and children die in Italy's worst train disaster, one of the worst in all of Europe. 14 people die instantly, burned to death or crushed as they sleep in their homes. 18 die later of severe burn injuries in the days and weeks after the accident. More than a decade after the tragedy, a deep sense of injustice still runs through this Tuscan community as the families continue to fight for truth and change. San Martino di Trecate, Piedmont. Every day, dozens of trains leave the rusty tracks from this 2-kilometer-long labyrinth of high, belching smokestacks of the Sarpom ExxonMobil oil refinery in the Po Valley Plain near Milan. Freight train 50325 leaves Trecate oil refinery on June the 29th, 2009 at 3:35 in the afternoon. The locomotive is pulling 14 tanker cars, each carrying 45 metric tons of LPG, a total of 630 tons. They are bound for Aversana Petroli, a gas company in southern Italy. The convoy stops at Trecate station for a safety and logistics check by Trenitalia, Italy's railway company. It is given the green light, and it rumbles on toward the sea, passing Genoa and changing drivers at La Spezia. It is a warm summer evening, shortly before midnight, and people are still strolling about the Tuscan city of Viareggio as the train approaches. Marco Piagentini and his wife, Stefania, are settling in for bed in Via Ponchielli, having already put to sleep their 3 sons, Leonardo, 8, Luca, 4, and Lorenzo, 2.
I was down on the couch watching television. The kids were sleeping, so there was that moment of freedom when you can actually relax a bit. Then I heard this strange noise. It was abnormal, because trains, of course, make noise normally when they go by.
Freight train 50325 passes through the station at 90 kilometers per hour, just under the 100 km/h speed limit. Then, 400 meters past the main station, it screeches off the rails and begins flipping onto its side. The axle of the first wagon has broken in half, and the wagons begin to veer off the track. The first tank wagon falls onto its side and rolls over a railroad spike, ripping a large hole along its side until it comes tumbling to a halt to the left. The next 4 wagons also overturn, and the 2 following come off the rails but remain upright. Emanuela Menichetti, 21, has just returned from a vacation with her friend Sara.
That night, Emanuela was sleeping at her friend Sara's house, and they were playing cards on the bed. That's what her father told me, because that night 3 people died. Sara, her mother, and Emanuela. He was the only survivor. They ran out to see what was happening, and in that house there were 4 people. 3 died, and he was the one who survived.
Disaster is about to strike. What they cannot know is that a silent but deadly killer is on the loose. A blue cloud of liquefied petroleum gas is spreading into the streets and seeping into homes and cars. Just seconds before the tragedy, Marco Piagentini steps outside and smells the gas.
I went in the house, got my wife and kids. I got the middle one, and Stefania got the little one. And we went outside. I got onto the pavement on the other side of the road and realized that Leonardo was missing. I leave Stefania and Lorenzo on the pavement. I put Luca in the car that was parked next to my wife, and I start going back in. I reach the front door, and I hear an explosion. I look up, and I see a wall of fire that's higher than my house.
The gas spreads for just over 2 minutes, and then, at 11:51, ignites. The explosion is massive, heard all across the city as a flash of white, and then a series of fireballs. Donatella Francesconi was the local newspaper reporter on duty that night for Il Tirreno.
C'era la preoccupazione che potesse essere inalato da parte della popolazione.
There was the worry that there could be something toxic that could be inhaled by the residents. The first anxiety on the station side of town was getting thousands of people who had come out onto the street away from the area, because the whole town had heard the explosions, seen the flames and the red sky.
Il cielo rosso si erano visti da tutte le parti della città.
As fire begins racing through the city, one of the train drivers, Andrea D'Alessandro, calls the station manager as he flees.
Pronto! Sono il macchinista del treno a Viareggio. Abbiamo deragliato, noi siamo scappati, ma è scoppiato tutto. Portavamo gas liquefatto infiammabile. Blocca i treni più lontano che poi da Viareggio. È scoppiato tutto qua. È scoppiato. C'è la stazione in fiamme.
It is the beginning of a decade-long nightmare. The initial explosion brought down 3 residential buildings near the station. Vehicles exploded like napalm bombs as the fire followed the gas. Marco's house collapsed onto him in a pile of burning rubble. He was unable to reach Leonardo.
I thought I had completely melted because I could not even move a finger on my hand. Then I started yelling help, even though I could not breathe. I could hear explosions because there were cars and motorcycles exploding continuously. The heat was excruciating. I could feel everything burning, my feet burning, and I couldn't do anything. I was conscious. It was like in an oven.
Le bimbe uscirono. The girls went out and ran towards the state route, Aurelia. Emanuela fell, and Sara managed to pick her up. Then they laid down on the pavement, down there on the Viareggio. There is a photo, coincidentally, and it's of Sarah and my daughter lying on the ground, totally naked, eaten up by fire, with a volunteer worker who was picking them up.
Con un volontario che le stava prendendo.
Via, sta per esplodere, giù, 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 giù.
Across the city, residents were fleeing for their lives. Firefighters at the scene knew that they had to get closer to fight the flames engulfing Viareggio after a train derailed. What had exploded? One firefighter climbed up to a pedestrian walkway over the railway and saw the gas sign on one of the 14 tanks. LPG. Immediately, the firefighters began trying to cool the other 13 time bombs that could explode at any minute.
One of the
experts in the civil parties told us it would have taken just one more tank to blow up to raise Viareggio to the ground all the way to the sea.
Daniela Rombi got a call from her daughter, Emanuela Menichetti, just 21, who said she was in the emergency room of the hospital in Versilia.
Mi squilla il telefono e mi dicono.
My phone rang and they said, "This is the hospital, Versilia, and Emanuela wants to talk to you." And I said, "Emanuela, weren't you supposed to stay at home?" You know, even a little angrily. And she said, "No, Mummy, there was an accident, there was a fire." I said, what do you mean by a fire? What fire? And she said, "Don't worry, Mum, nothing happened to me." So I got to the hospital at Cesanello, and there was another guy running through the corridor like we were. And I said, "Are you from Viareggio? What happened?" And he said, "A train exploded." I couldn't get my head around it because in my mind, at most, a train would have just derailed.
Continuavo a non capire perché per me I treni al massimo deragliavano.
When firefighters finally reached Marco Piagentini, he was alive but had suffered third-degree burns across all of his body.
I heard a voice saying, "Is there anybody here? Is there anybody here?" And I yelled, and they heard me, and they said, "Don't worry, we will come back and pull you out." And I said, "Hurry up, because I can't stay alive much longer. Life was draining out of me." Then, when they extracted me from the rubble, I fainted.
His wife died after 3 days of agony. His youngest son after 2. The 5-year-old had been burned alive. Marco woke up from a coma in the Padua burn ward a month later. Amazingly, they found Leonardo, saved from the crumbling house by a mattress that protected him. A moment of hope in a night filled with terror and death. The morning after, pictures and video of the fire had circulated around the world. The station smouldered. The scorched earth spread for kilometers from the sea to the station to the Croce Verde headquarters to Via Ponchielli.
It was the beginning of summer because it was the 29th of June. There were people in the streets, they were carefree, they were tourists, but instead there was silence. Flags were at half-mast in the beach bars, there was no music, they were days of silence.
The news started to come out of the deceased. Viareggio has 66,000 residents. It is not a big city. We all know each other. So this constant bulletin announcing the dead was excruciating. Incredibly, some of the victims were the very residents who had 8 years earlier formally requested a barrier between the track and the street. A request never acted on by Ferrovie dello Stato.
The gas found a way to get here because on this side there was no wall, there was an open fence, while on the other side there was a wall. So the wall would have been a mitigating factor in the disaster. The request for that wall was signed by people who died that very night. There are the signatures of people who are no longer here today.
Daniela Rombi had spoken to her daughter immediately after the explosion, so was taken aback by the news she received the following day at the hospital.
Verso le 7:30 arriva il professore, il primario, con un
Around
medico che
7:30, the professor arrived, the lead surgeon with another doctor who was crying. He said she was severely burned. We've treated her, and they just kept talking and talking. And at the end I said, but wait, she's not going to die because I spoke to her. She'll be okay, won't she? And he looked at me and he said, Mum, perhaps you don't understand. She could pass away from one minute to the next.
Può accadere da un momento all'altro.
The city was still smoking the next day, June the 30th, when railway officials addressed the press and public gathered at City Hall.
Nella sala di rappresentanza del municipio di Viareggio, gremita.
In the city hall, packed full with citizens and journalists, railway CEO Mauro Moretti arrived and in a very few words said two things. There was no responsibility of the Ferrovie dello Stato and that they would not pay a single euro for what had happened.
Pagato €1 per quello che era accaduto.
In the beginning, he became a symbol because of his arrogant behavior. The ex-CEO, Mauro Moretti, never said sorry. Even, allow me to use the expression politically, never gave a justification for what happened. He just put himself out of the context.
Anzi, si è posto fuori dal contesto.
More than 30,000 people attended the state funeral on July the 7th for 15 of the victims. Another 7 were buried with Islamic rites in Morocco. Other victims, like Emanuela and Sara, were fighting for their lives in burn wards, with their families at their side.
After 15 or 20 days, they asked me if I wanted to go in and see her. And I was afraid and said, no, I don't want to go in. And this nurse, an amazing male nurse, said, why don't you want to go in? And I said, if I go in and touch her and then she dies, what will I do? And he said, but if you don't go in, you don't touch her and she still dies, what will you do?
It was the last time Daniela saw her daughter alive.
E quindi entrai. Nel viso lei non era.
And so I went in. Her face had not been that disfigured. She was beautiful. She was sleeping. But this young man told me, don't lift up the sheets. And I don't know why, but I didn't lift them up.
E io non so perché non le alzai.
Emanuela died 42 agonizing days later. In the days after the deadly Viareggio train derailment and explosion, prosecutors launched an investigation, and experts descended onto the scene to measure the destruction. The first 5 tanks overturned 370 meters from the point of derailment. The broken axle was hurled 30 meters. Even without microscopic examination, several layers of paint applied to cover the decades of corrosion and rust were visible to the eye. For prosecutors, it was immediately clear they needed to know everything about freight train 50325 and the broken, decrepit axle 98331, owned by the European subsidiaries of GATX, an American multinational rail wagon leasing company. Engineer Fabrizio Del Rico was one of the technical experts called in to testify for civil parties.
L'assile di fatto è un vecchio prodotto.
The axle is an old product from 1974. but we only have documentation on this axle since the early 2000s. The chronology from 1974 to the early 2000s was not supplied.
L'applicazione al 2002 non è nota, non è stata fornita.
Axle 98331, according to records provided by GATX, had actually been built in 1974 at the LKW Karl Marx Lokomotivbau in Babelsberg, near Berlin, when East Germany was still behind the Iron Curtain. An axle that travels in snow goes under stresses that are different from one in warm weather. Knowing where it travels would have been important, even how many kilometers it traveled. No one knew. It was used in Eastern Europe for 2 decades, before arriving at ZOS Trnava workshop in Slovakia in 2002 for a reprofiling and inspection, which it passed, so it could be resold and reused yet again. It would take 4 years to complete a proper inquiry, exposing how the deadly train came together in a web of questionable deals that put profit before safety.
Le società del gruppo Ferrovie dello Stato,
the Ferrovie dello Stato and its subsidiaries did not know what kind of maintenance the tanker cars that were rolling on their rails had undergone, nor the instrumentation they were equipped with.
Sulla propria rete ferroviaria.
Aversana Petroli, a company belonging to the Cosentino family, repeatedly investigated for its alleged organized crime ties, needed to move LPG cheaply from the Exxon refinery to southern Italy. The Italian State Railways is a holding company that used a number of its smaller private subsidiaries to make the train happen. FS Logistica rented tank wagons for just 22 to 28 euros a day from GATX Europe, an Austria-based subsidiary of the American multinational. Then, FS Logistica did a deal with Rete Ferroviaria Italiana, which operated the train tracks, as well as with Trenitalia, which had the locomotive and the drivers. The deal with Aversana Petroli would bring a loss of 12,000 euros a year for Italian railways.
Un elemento determinante in ogni indagine, cioè cercare I rapporti economici.
One of the determining elements in all investigations was to look at the nature of the economic deals being made and expose them. It emerged that FS Logistica paid 22 euros a day to transport a train from northern Italy all the way to Campania. Renting a car or a bicycle in vacation costs more than that. So this was an alarm bell, because the chain of relationships eventually do concretely become an actual train that crosses Italy.
E diventa un treno che attraversa tutta l'Italia.
After passing inspection, the wheel set was mounted onto wagon number 3381 in Poland. GATX leased the wagon to Cargo Chemical SRL in Italy, which later became FS Logistica SPA. It arrived in Italy in January of 2005 for private use for the Trecate-Gricignano line, subleased from Rete Ferroviaria Italiana. In June 2006, the tanker car and its axle and wheel sets passed an inspection in Slovakia, despite a crack which experts said had likely started to form. Cargo Chemical paid a measly €4 for the inspection. By September 2006, it was rolling again. Since the wagon was bound for private freight use, no paperwork was exchanged about the history of the wagon or its parts.
On the 30th of June, FS Logistica writes a fiery email to GATX. It's part of the trial documents and were central to the case and the effort to try to identify who was responsible. And they wrote, "What did you send us? Tell us what you sent us."
Cargo Chemical had rented a wagon with axle 98331 from GATX and then subleased it to Trenitalia that actually handled the train. But the wheel set and axle were flagged as having a worn area by Deutsche Bahn inspectors in Ingolstadt, and it was sent by GATX to Jungenthal workshop in Hanover for inspection, a company under GATX's control.
L'eliminazione dal carrello, quindi la separazione dal carrello sotto cui erano montate.
The separation from wagon and the parts mounted on it happens in 2008. And this happens because wheels were flagged as having been worn from excessive braking. So they were sent to the Jugendtal workshop in Hanover, and that workshop was under the oversight of GATX.
Per essere manutenute.
They were completely overhauled.
Essere completamente revisionate.
Again, the crack went undetected, although Jugendtal claims they ran ultrasound tests and magnetic particle tests. 3 layers of old paint suggested the axle had not been sanded in order to perform these tests.
Durante la revisione che avviene all'interno
During maintenance at Jugendtal, they did a complete overhaul of the axle. But our tests took us to the absolute certain conclusion that no magnetoscopic or ultrasound tests had been completed.
Eseguito e nulla di controllo ultrasonoro è stato eseguito su quella sile.
GATX Rail Austria ordered the axle to be transferred from Jugendtal to Cima Riparazione mechanic shop in Mantua to be mounted on the wagon. And still, no one saw or flagged the crack during what was supposed to be a thorough inspection.
Viene scartato il pacco che viene inviato con la certificazione.
They opened the package. The 2 axles were taken out and they were mounted on the wagon and then put back into circulation. And they made a series of trips before arriving at the end of their voyage at Viareggio.
Farà una serie di viaggi per poi terminare la sua corsa a Viareggio.
Nell'aula si dice: ma in cosa consiste il controllo visivo che voi dovevate fare sempre per il manuale VP di questa assile?
When in court they asked what it meant to do a visual inspection. The mechanics responded that it meant looking in the track to see if the package was okay. The fact that they all had a rule book that was standardised for everyone led them to go a bit on autopilot, so reducing times and costs, this is the main point, and then on to the next axle. It was a bit of a factory. Go, 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 push them out, produce, on to the next one, and, you know, cross your fingers.
Sfornare, andare avanti e sperare.
Laboratory analysis would estimate the crack went back at least 10 to 20 years, during which the axle had travelled somewhere between 500,000 and 1.2 million kilometres before the fatal derailment in Viareggio. So, who owned the killer train? And who was in charge of maintenance? What emerged over 8 years and 2 trials about Freight Train 50325 and the infamous Axle 98331 is a cautionary tale of a capitalist shell game that saw old parts from the former Soviet bloc sold or leased onto Western Europe's railroads at rock-bottom prices through Central European middlemen.
FS Logistica fa un contratto con Trenitalia.
FS Logistica does a contract with Trenitalia, which owns the locomotive. Trenitalia doesn't have tank cars, so it rents them from GATX. Then Trenitalia makes a whole train that was pulled by Trenitalia with tanks by GATX that runs on the RFI, Rete Ferroviaria Italiana.
Viaggia sulla rete di RFI, Rete Ferroviaria Italiana. Per Ferrovie dello Stato sarebbe stato importantissimo sapere.
For Italian railways, it would have been important to have traceability. But it is evident if Italian railways had a system of traceability of the axles, wheels, brakes and other parts, it could have better managed this situation and enacted mitigating factors.
E quindi porre in essere delle misure mitigative, si dicono.
And even though the axle broke, the fire would not have happened if the tank had not been ripped open during the derailment. What caused it to rupture? Prosecutors maintained it was a railroad stake, specifically stake number 24, that had been left in the curve of the railway despite regulations requiring stakes to be removed. Fabrizio De Rico and his team created a 3D video that treated the derailment like a crime scene.
Dobbiamo ricostruire la scena del delitto.
We reconstructed the scene of the crime, using photographs and looking at all the points of evidence left by the wagon as it transited through the station. In other words, the footprints of the assassin.
Ovvero le orme dell'assassino.
Il quadro accusatorio secondo noi è stato immediatamente chiaro.
The accusatory framework for us was immediately clear. The first axle was not properly maintained, it broke, and that started the whole dynamic. And the rupture of the tank by the stake which ripped it open. This was also a theme during the trial.
Anche questo è stato un tema del processo, ha squarciato la cisterna.
No matter what did or did not cause the rupture, the accident would never have happened had the axle not broken in the first place.
Da tecnico.
From a technical point of view, we shouldn't even be here talking about the stake because the axle should not have broken in the first place. Because quite simply, the maintenance that should have been done, they decided not to do. Full stop. As far as the rupture of the tank is concerned, we know for certain that it was the stake. From all the accurate reconstructions that we made, because that was our duty towards those who asked us what was the cause.
Ma che cosa è stato?
Why wasn't the Italian railway inspecting and certifying the public and private rolling stock transporting people and freight along its lines? Why hadn't the spikes been removed? Independent forensic experts performed stress tests on a model of the axle, carrying out metallurgy tests, ultrasound and magnetoscopic testing in 2011. The crack may have formed 10 or even 20 years ago, but by the time the axle broke, it was probably 10 to 13 centimeters long, with a slant. The crack should have been easy to spot in a visual check, had one actually been carried out.
Vi è il cedimento dell'assile ferroviario, che non doveva mai avvenire.
Here we have the breakage of the railway axle that should never have happened. Did we have the condition to avoid the axle from breaking? Certainly yes. Was it unpredictable? No, on the contrary, it's easy to predict breakages, especially on axles that have this very visible damage.
If the checks are done only partially, or are just on paper, whereby what's important is the paperwork, this is a whole world that needs to be corrected. Till today, we still don't have information. Despite all the requests, we still don't know what has been done to improve safety. Between June 2009 in Viareggio and today, we still don't know.
Il sistema ferroviario è un sistema che da sempre si dà le proprie regole.
The Italian railway system always regulates itself, just until a few years before the accident in Viareggio. So up to 2008, there was no national body overseeing railway safety. The entity that oversaw the railways was the railways itself. The inspected was also the inspector.
Era controllore e controllato.
During the course of the trial, a number of scandalous failings in railway safety emerged, and one man was deemed responsible above all others. The courts discovered that most of the decisions leading up to the Viareggio train disaster fell under the oversight of a number of European rail company bosses and those reporting directly to them. Most notably, Italian Railways CEO Mauro Moretti, who, before a Senate inquiry, stated that the state-owned train company, Ferrovie dello Stato, had an excellent record, aside from Viareggio, which he described as an unfortunate episode. To speak about an unfortunate episode when 32 people died was out of place. That term came out many times and especially stuck with the families of the victims because they considered it injury upon injury. It would have just taken a bit more solidarity instead of discussing an unfortunate episode. Also because we know from what came out in the trial that this disaster was anything but an unfortunate episode.
Moretti, sappiate che in audizione...
When Moretti said in the Senate hearing that, aside from the unfortunate episode of Viareggio, they have got better in terms of safety, then he later said, every time there is a train accident, it is as if the world is collapsing. Well, for us, the world did collapse.
Ferrovia sembra che caschi il mondo, ma a noi c'è cascato il mondo.
Every wagon that derailed at Viareggio had been subleased from abroad at rock-bottom prices and inspected in Slovakia in 2002 and 2006 for a cost of just over €4 per check. Things were being done on the cheap, and safety warnings were ignored. Jugenthal mechanics testified they never found cracks in axles, only in wheel rims. German reports showed there had been 7 accidents between 2000 and 2006 in which axles broke. Yet GATX openly blocked an effort by Germany to freeze use of its old axles.
La circolare che l'agenzia tedesca per la sicurezza ferroviaria EVA aveva emesso nel...
The report that the German transport agency EVA had circulated in July of 2007 said that there had been repeated important railway accidents throughout Europe, fortunately without any victims, in which axles built in Germany had broken, and they said to stop them. GATX, which is the company that was owner of the tank cars that derailed in Viareggio 2 years later, injuncted against the report, which was frozen and not acted upon.
The wheels of Italian justice grind slowly, but the trains continued to derail at full speed in the following years. In 2012, regional train 2855 from Voghera to Rimini derailed, injuring 30 of the 250 passengers on board. In 2016, 2 regional passenger trains on a single-track section of the Bari-Barletta railway collided head-on, killing 23 and injuring 54. In 2018, a train derailed near Pioltello, killing 3 and injuring 46.
In un altro caso di trasporto merci non pericolose di un treno deragliato.
In another case, there was a train transporting non-dangerous freight that derailed in the station of Bressanone. A few years later, it emerged that the workshop had not followed the correct assembly of the axles and the wheel sets. We are talking yet again about a derailment post-Viareggio. And just coincidentally, once again, we are talking about the same workshop.
Casualmente, della stessa officina.
Little has changed since the Viareggio disaster. Freight trains can still roll through towns at 100 kilometers per hour, and there is no requirement to tell local authorities what they are hauling. Viareggio even saw its station master removed in a recent round of cuts. The presence of the station master prevented more victims. That night, the station master stopped an intercity train at Torre del Lago. He stopped it 2 kilometers from Viareggio, so it did not find itself in the middle of the explosion. The lack of accountability of Italian railways and the arrogance of its managers only further enraged families of the victims, who began seeking out solidarity from associations of victims of other tragedies where the state was negligent. They called themselves My Ideal World, in Italian, Il Mondo che Vorrei.
We started meeting with other associations. We met with those from the Moby Prince in Livorno, and we went there. And there it was born, this idea to create a network.
We went to Turin to meet with the mothers of the Thyssen victims 3 times. We went to San Giuliano di Puglia, to Vajont.
There was Casalecchio di Reno, the asbestos problem of Casale Monferrato. There were many associations, and Viareggio was, unfortunately, just one of the many. Disasters in the country where no one was taking forward the memory of the case, except the families of the victims.
After the immediate media coverage of each disaster, a disturbing underlying trend remains.
c'era il profitto messo.
Profit was put ahead of human life. This was the common thread. This allowed us to find ourselves in a difficult moment, in life-changing circumstances, when we had lost our loved ones, to find the courage to say, we must do something.
Veramente dobbiamo cambiare qualcosa.
4 years after one of Italy's most fatal train derailments and explosions, the trial of those accused began in November 2013 and unfolded across 140 hearings over nearly 3 years. 7.5 years after the tragedy, judges issued the first round of convictions, a total of 250 years in prison for 33 different people on trial. GATX Rail Germany and its subsidiary GATX Rail Austria were found responsible for the rolling stock, and top administrators at both companies convicted. Mechanics at Jungenthal and Cima machine shops were also convicted for not following standard inspection procedures. Former Leonardo CEO Mauro Moretti was sentenced for his role as CEO of Rete Ferroviaria Italiana from 2001 to 2006, but acquitted for his role as CEO of Ferrovie dello Stato from 2006 to 2014, while former RFI CEO Michele Mario Elia was also initially convicted.
La maggior parte delle condanne sono state confermate.
The majority of the convictions were confirmed, including those of Italian Railways and GATX and Jungenthal, the two major companies involved. But some sentences were reduced on appeal because of the time that had passed, because some of the crimes were beyond the statute of limitations.
Fra il primo grado e l'appello alcuni reati si sono prescritti.
Two crimes were beyond the statute of limitations: the bodily harm and the manslaughter by fire. Our lawyers tell us, with all the years that have gone by, causing manslaughter by fire added up to perhaps 3 or 4 months less of prison. Aside from the fact that I want them to do those 3 or 4 months, that's just my opinion. But it isn't a question of 3 or 4 months, it's the principle. If there's no longer the crime of homicide by fire, then what did these people die of? What did my daughter die of? She didn't have a tumour. She wasn't a drug addict. She wasn't going at 150 kilometres per hour in a car. She was at home. They were all at home. What did they die of?
Era a casa. Tutti erano a casa. Ma di che cosa sono morti?
Ci sono magistrati, ci sono.
There are magistrates, judges, courts, the accused, but there are also the users of justice, us, who unfortunately find themselves facing a deficient justice system. We just want to let people know and ask those who are qualified to make justice just. Let the truth come out. There is just one truth, not two truths like they say. A truth from the trial and the real truth. No, it can't be broken down into parts. You can't have a trial for the deaths of 32 people and then not give those 32 people justice, because that's where it all begins.
Perché tutto nasce da lì.
The Viareggio families were among those who lobbied for an important victory: passing of the law prohibiting a statute of limitations in certain cases.
E la paura è tanta, perché comunque il tempo passa, comunque loro sono.
We are afraid because time passes, because they are powerful and we're nobodies, and because they go around and always remix themselves into key positions. But we're watching, with our heads high, because we did not take any money. They did not buy the deaths of our children. We are holding our heads high. Watch out, watch out.
Guai a loro, guai a loro.
Of the 339 million trains that rolled along Italy's tracks the year before the Viareggio accident, only 18% were freight trains. Yet it took just one to change the face of this Tuscan town forever.
This silence, this stopping of everything, this silence and this dramatic magic moment repeats itself every 29th of June.
Rosario Campo, 42 anni.
That night, we lost our loved ones. But what happened here in Viareggio touched the whole community. We found ourselves in a situation like when you are little and you discover that Santa Claus does not exist. Here in Viareggio, we found ourselves realizing that Santa Claus no longer exists.
Babbo Natale non esisteva più.
Ma te guarda come siamo fortunati, diceva mio marito. Lavoriamo mezza giornata al giorno perché
Look at how fortunate we are, we would say, because he worked at the post office and I worked in the city hall. We worked part-time and then had the rest of the day to enjoy life. The girls were fine. We laughed and joked about it, as we were a normal family. What do we have to lose? Well, we lost it all. They killed us, sending trains around that they didn't even know where they came from. There were parts from 1974. How can you transport gas on top of that? That train was a piece of junk.
Ma si può mandarci sopra il gas? Ma si può, era un ferro vecchio quel treno.
Lì c'è stato un momento, no, in cui a un certo punto...
There was a moment where at a certain point you let yourself go or you decide to live. Despite the fact that I was immobile in a bed and I did not even know if I was going to survive. They didn't know if I'd survive. In my mind, I started modeling a thought, which was a choice to live, consciously knowing that although my loved ones didn't make it, to live also for them, as best I could.
Ce l'avevano fatta, di vivere anche per loro al meglio.
The investigation and trials that followed the Viareggio disaster raised serious questions about the lack of regulation of these travelling bombs, and about the shoddy oversight of rail safety and maintenance throughout Europe.
I would like you to try, just for one day, to feel what we feel. Just for one day, just faking it, to feel what we feel with your positions of authority, what we feel in our heart, just for a day, and then no more. Then I hope you can live with your conscience.
It is a catastrophe that killed 32 people, yet could have been prevented. And it is a disaster that could happen again in any other town with a rail line, if Europe doesn't learn Viareggio's tragic lesson.